The real action, though, will be behind closed doors, won't it?
Yes, it absolutely will. We saw a series of hearings over several days in the Ways and Means Committee and in the Senate Finance Committee. The House released its bill and passed it through the entire chamber in just 2 weeks. Now, the Senate's going to have a bit of a tougher task because there are only 2 votes that Republicans can lose before this collapses. But a lot of what you're seeing in these committee hearings and markups is just theater. The real negotiations are happening behind the scenes between Republican and Republican.
And there are some sticking points there, for example, the SALT deduction and other things. But an interesting one is the deficit. Now, there are 3 senators that are deficit hawks and don't like the idea of adding 1.4 trillion. The president today just talked about welfare reform. Is that what he's going to dangle in front of these senators in order to get their votes on tax reform?
Right. I mean, a number of the deficit hawks who are raising concerns about the fact that this adds $1.5 trillion in red ink over the first 10 years and more over the long haul if these provisions don't expire, as Republicans say they won't. But the issue of welfare reform is something a number of conservatives in Congress support. It's something they want to do, and it's a way for the president to simply say, don't worry about the deficit now, we'll get to it with things like welfare reform. But, you know, people have tried to do that sort of thing in the past, and it means cutting very popular programs like food stamps, potentially Social Security and Medicare, which are extremely difficult to do. So it could be a political maneuver for the president to try to ease their concerns, but whether it'll happen is, remains to be seen. It's far from clear it would.
And Sahil, of course, we're expecting the Senate to pass a bill sometime next week. Once that's done, though, will there be enough time for a true conference committee, or is this too going to get fast-tracked?
Well, if they can do it quickly, there's no limit to how long a conference committee can take, and there's no minimum amount of time for it to take. So if Republicans in the House and the Senate can agree quickly on something, then they can fast-track it out of that conference committee very quickly. But, there are going to be negotiations between House Republican leaders and Senate Republican leaders that are already happening to try to get a piece of legislation through the Senate that, at the very least, won't be too offensive to House Republicans where they'll have to change major things. The real game is in the Senate right now. Republicans in the House have a 22-vote margin for error, so there's just more room they have to play with there. In the Senate, it's very, very narrow, as we saw with their attempt to repeal the health care law.
Sahil, what are Congress people and senators hearing from their constituents this week as they, go back to their home bases?
Well, it's an unpopular tax bill. It doesn't poll well. Republicans, for the most part, support it, but the general public, only 25%, according to a recent poll of Americans, believe this tax bill is good for them. They believe it's, for the most part, Americans believe it's going to add to the deficit. They believe it's going to help the wealthy at the expense of the middle class. And there are several provisions in here, including the elimination of the state and local tax deduction, that the country doesn't support at large. There are popular provisions like doubling the standard deduction. So it's a mixed bag, but overall, the real energy for this bill is not coming from constituents. It's not really coming from voters. It's coming from Republican donors who are demanding that the party deliver something. Don't end the entire year, go home for Christmas without anything. The biggest constituency here for this tax bill is corporate America. There's a massive cut in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%.